Hi, I'm Randolph Miller. Welcome to Bounce Around Charleston. Coming up on today's show, we will speak with Judge Bernard Fielding to talk about the history of Fielding Home for Funerals. Also, Sarah Reynolds from Charleston County Parks and Recreation will be here to talk about this year's Cajun Festival. And one of the stars of Fox's hit drama series headlined this year's 16th Annual Black Expo. Paisley Moore caught up with fans and Brashear Gray from the show Empire. And closing out the show, we'll have music from Tyler Boone. The story is told that when African Americans first started funeral homes, the families would live upstairs and the business would be downstairs. There is a living legend in the city of Charleston, Fielding Home for Funerals, founded in 1912. Let's hear the story from Bernard Fielding.
I don't think most of the older funeral homes had money to be building buildings, in other words, so they would buy a house or they would take their own house, in other words, and that's why it was called a home, you see what I'm saying? They would live on the upper stories. If it was 2 stories, they'd live on the second story. If it was 3, they would live on second and third, and the funeral home, of course, would have the entire first floor. That's the way it was here at 122 Logan Street, in other words. We lived on the second and third floor of this 3-story building, and we lived on the second floor of the 2-story building. And incidentally, this building is real Charleston history because, according to Herbert DeCosta, this was constructed about in the 1700s, in other words. This front part. The second part was a kitchen area, he says he thinks it was, and later on it was joined on to the 3-story building, you see.
He explains how Fielding Home for Funerals got started.
Well, my dad went to South Carolina State for a while, and then he was encouraged by family members to go to embalming school. And he left Charleston and went to New York City. In the picture, which is right behind you, that I've shown you, in other words, Renard Training School for Embalming. Mm-hmm. And as you saw on that picture, there was one little brown face up in the corner, and that's him. Everything on the front row were the professors, and then there were other students there, of course. My recollection is that Mayth Fleming, who was affiliated with Halston Funeral Home, in other words, also was a graduate of that school. And I suspect that at that time, in other words, in early 1900s, that may have been probably one of the few schools that they could go to at that time.
Here, he explains the struggles his dad had to endure to become a funeral home owner.
Well, my understanding is that family members and others encouraged him to go because really at that particular time the white undertakers were not particular, in other words, about burying black people, you see what I'm saying? And it was a struggle, an awful struggle, because most of his clients that he started off with on James Island and Johns Island and the surrounding islands. And of course, in order to even get to those places, you had to go down to the battery and get in a rowboat, okay, and go over to James Island in the rowboat, embalm the body one day, then they'd come back, and then the next day they would go over to the island, in other words, and have a funeral. So it wasn't something, I don't think, in other words, that our Caucasian funeral homes were interested in at that particular time, you see. Apparently he developed a passion and a love for it, and certainly his mother, Felicia Fielding Goodwin, was one of 3 ladies who were the founders of the Charleston, what is now the Charleston YWCA on Cumming Street, in other words. And that was again in the early 1900s. And she would get clothing from lots of people up in north, and she would get those boxes of clothing, and then she would distribute that to people on the islands, in other words. Certainly in the early 30s, in the Depression era, for example, my dad did a lot of bartering because we had a lot of sewing machines in the backyard. In other words, people didn't have any money, so he found other ways to get paid. And for your information, if you'd like to look up there on that other wall, you will see a funeral for Dr. Seabrook's wife that Herbert DeCosta was kind enough to pass on to us. And I think the entire funeral was a little over $300 and some. That's in the 1920s, in other words. Things have come a long way since then, as you can imagine. Yeah.
And he's hopeful that the legacy continues in carrying on the family's business.
But we're thankful that we've got right now, in other words, third and fourth generation participating in the business, and we hope, in other words, that they will be able to carry on after we second generation getting close to the grave, in other words, you see. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There are many locations in the Charleston area.
We've got 3 locations. This one is our principal downtown location that's been here, of course, since he bought this building in 1928. We also have a funeral home that we built from the ground up at the intersection of Old Meeting Street Road and Jacksonville Road. That was built in 1962 by Herbert DeCosta and designed by an architect. And then we have a building down on Highway 162, just past the town of Hollywood, but we actually are part of Hollywood, of the town of Hollywood, in other words. We built that. We renovated that building because there used to be a church, in other words, in about 1989, as I recall correctly.
If you're interested in getting into the funeral home business, here is some advice Mr. Bernard Fielding had to share.
Well, obviously, of course, they've got to go to school. In other words, it's like me going to law school. I finished 19 years of education in order to be a lawyer, in other words. But I think that more so than just getting an education, you've got to have a love, you've got to have a passion, you've got to have some sort of feeling for what it is that you're getting into. Because if you're not happy and you're not pleasant with what you do from day to day, you might well get out of it, in other words. And certainly the funeral home business is not a business, in other words, for anybody to just jump into because they see the shiny cars and they think, in other words, there's lots of money, in other words, in the business. You really have got to have a feeling for the public and be willing, in other words, to make tremendous sacrifices, because this business is 48 hours a day and 14 days a week. In other words, we've got a staff of full-time people and we've got a staff of part-time people, and they're constantly on the go, in other words, all the time, you see. Yeah.
Well, Mr. Bernard Fielding, yeah, we want to thank you for being a part of Bounce Around Charleston.
Well,
and know that Fielding Home for Funerals is a living legend in the community of Charleston.
We thank you, and we sincerely hope, in other words, that it will continue to be a living legend for many generations in the future.